Thank you. This is awesome. I just want to thank everyone who put together the TEDxStetsonU event. This is so cool. I've played soccer here at Stetson for the men's team for the past 4 years, and so I've played in front of screaming fans, tournaments, championship games, but this is still by far the most nerve-wracking experience I've had. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. Over the past year and a half or so here at Stetson, I have enrolled in a feminist philosophy course, and I've also become vegetarian. And these are pretty two unrelated topics, except for the ways that many of my male friends, teammates, and colleagues reacted to them. With varying degrees of hostility and joking around, I heard things like, "Dude, that's so gay," "what a bitch," "pussy," and "faggot." Now, I know my friends had met my girlfriend, so they weren't explicitly addressing my sexuality or my sexual orientation. And instead, what they were doing is what a lot of gender studies scholars call homosocial bonding, which is where men perform gender roles for and with each other in a group setting. And so what they were doing is identifying certain things like about women's issues or not eating meat, and identifying them as not masculine. And so you can think of it as a box of masculinity, right, where only certain traits or characteristics are allowed in, and everything else is labeled either effeminate or homosexual, but certainly not masculine. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, boys will be boys, that's just the way men are. But this is in fact not true, and this is because there's no natural way for men to act in society. And this is because there's a difference between sex and gender. Sex, referring to one's biological and sexual and reproductive self, whereas gender refers to the social and political positions we then place those bodies into in society. We know this from studying gynocentric matriarchal societies, very women-centered societies, cultures that recognize 3 genders, as well as the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois tribe in North America, who, interestingly enough, had no reported cases of rape by men or women. Their respect for women in all walks of life, as well as their very connectedness with the natural environment, were actually seen as reasons for viewing them as lesser developed beings by the Europeans who came in. So you can imagine the white European colonists coming to what they thought was a new land and saying, "What are you guys doing? You don't dominate your women in the political sphere? You haven't exploited all these natural resources around you? If only you were as advanced as we are." Now, I'm not here to bash white European colonists, right? What I'm trying to point out is the way that gender roles are socially and culturally specific. They're certainly not natural. As Dr. Sally Haslinger writes, once we've noted that our experience of the world is already an interpretation of it, we begin to raise questions about the adequacy of our conceptual framework. So in other words, once we've realized that what we thought was an objective reality is really only our subjective perception of it, we begin to assess whether our way of doing things is good or bad. And so I'm here today to talk to you about the social construction of gender, and specifically masculinity. Hopefully we can all come out of this with the understanding that feminism is very much for men too. Now, I'm going to continue here in a second, and we're going to have a little bit of fun with the way that meat and food symbolize masculinity. I'd like to then talk about how this restrictive view of masculinity that we often see is bad for everyone. And finally, I'd like to talk about the invisibility of unexamined privilege. Now, I mentioned my vegetarianness earlier, and I will spare you all my personal, ethical, environmental, and health reasons for not eating meat. One, because it would take up way too much time, but also because it's entirely beside the point. But what I learned from this is that what I thought were my personal food choices actually had social consequences and were met with different social expectations. We need not look any further than pop culture and mass media messages to understand how masculinity is constructed and then reinforced. So I'd like to show you an ad that aired a few years ago for Hummer, and we'll just watch the video and then we can talk about it afterwards. Now, I would show the ad again for you guys, but I don't want to mess with the technology and have something go wrong. So if it went by a little too fast for you, towards the end there, basically a man walks into a grocery store and starts checking out the items he's collected, right? And he's got some vegetables, some greens, but most noticeably is tub of organic tofu. And this is meant to symbolize, just pretty much any food that isn't meat. It's almost an anti-meat substance in this context. And so as he's checking out his items, the next guy comes up to him and starts laying down a rack of ribs, some steaks, sausages, just animals on animals. But also charcoal, right? So it's not just about what a real man eats, but how he prepares it and who's preparing it. So you can imagine a man in his backyard grilling his steaks and just in his element, certainly not in the kitchen where women prepare food. And I just thought this was a really interesting ad because it's not a food commercial. It's a car commercial, but it's using food in a way to symbolize masculinity. And so, the first guy, he looks over and he sees, he almost has a crisis in his masculinity, and he's not sure what to do about it. He feels a void in what it means to be a real man. And so what does he do? He sees a magazine and goes out and buys a Hummer, effectively restoring the balance, right? And so, on a funny aside as well, it's also equating masculinity with environmental degradation, right? Because if you're not a man, you've got to somehow go out and buy this big gas-guzzling car. But masculinity doesn't just use food in ways that it's constructed. We only need to look at, from the moment we're born, we're receiving gender-specific messaging. You're either wrapped in a blue towel or a pink towel. If a boy gets hurt and scrapes his knee or something, starts to cry, he's immediately told from a very, very young age, don't cry, be tough, you got to be strong, don't show any weakness. Whereas a girl in the very same situation is treated much differently. She's allowed to show emotions, and she's cared for very gently. And so as these children grow up, you just walk into any Toys R Us aisle, right? And you will very easily see, the girls' toys and the boys' toys. It's an easy distinction. For the girls, you've got they're socialized to play with pink Barbie dolls and other kinds of dolls, whereas boys are taught to play with blue action figures, trucks, building blocks, these G.I. Joes with their biceps out to here, right? So on one hand, you're getting these very hyper-sexualized images of women for girls to play with, and these very hyper-masculine toys for boys. And the problem with this is that these are very restrictive views of both genders, but these constant images are the only images that we're really seeing. We're not seeing anything else. And what I'd like to emphasize is how unrealistic this picture is. And so as men go on living their lives, they often struggle to legitimize themselves as real men in different contexts. And I'm not saying that men are the worst victims here, because often, as I said in homosocial bonding, it's melded with misogyny as well as homophobia. So it's identifying everything that isn't masculine and kind of denigrating that while bringing up the value of being a man. And in a male-dominated society where men dictate how society functions and the values that we should have, masculinity can also operate in systemic and institutional ways as well. It's so important for us to reject this as the natural way of things. It's not natural for only 15% of CEOs and higher up in corporate positions to be women. It's not natural for only 18% of Congress to be made up of women. And it's certainly not natural for women to be paid less than men for the same exact jobs. Instead, these are symptoms of a society that's been created by men, which values masculinity above any other notions of gender. And so while gender is this construct, right, it's created, it still has very real consequences and implications for those affected by it in society. But as the dominant group, men, we don't really have to think about these kind of things. And this brings me to my last point on privilege. And just as you can't talk about racism without talking about white privilege, we cannot properly talk about sexism without addressing male privilege. And male privilege is the privilege not to have to think about one's gendered identity. So when we hear the word gender, we often think women. When we hear the word race, we think black, Hispanic, Asian, and other minority groups. And we hear the word sexual orientation, we think gay people or the LGBTQ community. What we're not thinking of, and what's allowed to go unexamined, are white, straight males. And this is who we're not talking about. And this is the reason why, when we hear reports on the news of rapes or sexual assaults, they're often in the passive voice. A woman was raped or a woman was assaulted. And it's very rarely that it says, a man raped a woman. The man is left out of this. He's allowed to be invisible. So he's not only left out of the headline, but he's left out of how we view the problem and then how we view solutions to solve this. It's the reason why in the wake of these mass shootings, we grasp for explanations of mental illness when the perpetrators are white, young boys, and adults. They're allowed and they have the privilege of being viewed as individuals with personal and psychological problems rather than having their actions be attributed to some sort of racialized or gendered group that they belong to. And so I'd like to conclude by saying that I do not wish to generalize the experiences of all men as the same, just as a white feminist would not want to generalize her experiences as those of all women. We have many intersections of our own identity that deserve to be heard and given a voice. What I am interested in is that the belief that men can do better. By examining how society tells us to be a real man and assessing our own male privilege on an individual and institutional level, I think we can begin to deconstruct how masculinity is created. Not only do I believe that this can have lasting and positive impacts on how we view our own individual and institutional relationships with each other, but also believe that this can change the way we view war, social development, and our relationship to the environment. The goal for men in feminism is to create a more just and egalitarian society while becoming better and more well-rounded men in the process. Thank you.